Hello, Morgan. How are you? So, a couple people are going to be out today. Jesse's going to be out. Amanda's on vacation. And I may be expecting someone to come and give an update for GSOC, but I'm not sure. Good morning. So, today I'm just going to go through some things that, are new and talk about. And we might not have a full meeting today, but it'll be a nice update for things as they stand. So, this was the last week of Neuromatch, the third week. My groups, they had good projects. One was on looking at the Stringer data set from Neuromatch, which is a data set where they have neuroimaging and behavior in mice. So they have, I think it's optical imaging that they collect from a freely behaving mouse, and the mouse is actually looking at different visual gratings, and it's serving as a cue to do different tasks, different motor tasks. So they analyze that with the, some sort of deep learning technique. And then the other group was looking at fMRI resting state, and which is interesting because resting state is not necessarily, it's very controversial as to what it actually is. So resting state is where, originally in fMRI experiments, it was where people looked at a fixation cross and they kind of just let their mind rest. And this was something as sort of a control to something like an attention task or a learning and memory task. So the thinking was, well, you're not doing anything, you're looking at a fixation cross. You're putting everything out of your mind. And then, of course, yeah, it didn't actually turn out to be the case. There was a lot of activity. It's a very rich activity when you're sort of resting. So that's what they were looking at, and they were looking at that in terms of some tasks and some regions of the brain. So these are projects that that students can do in like 2 or 3 weeks. They're not like nature paper quality projects. I mean, they're just kind of like you take a data set, you work on it, and you see what's there. You use a technique, and the whole idea is the process. You know how to take a question and answer it with data, and then write it up. And that was it. It was good. I think they both did well. And I think Neuromatch went pretty well. I was watching the closing ceremonies yesterday. It sounds like they're really getting into a lot of they have a lot of different tentacles now. So like they have Climate Match, which is a sort of focused on climate change and some of the yeah. So it's not just it was, first of all, it's computational neuroscience, then it was deep learning, and now they've gone into climate change, and they get people who are experts in the area, and they put together a course. It's like 2 or 3 weeks long, just like Neuromatch. So that's pretty much it for Neuromatch. I'm going to talk about a topic now. Amanda wanted to know something about causality, and unfortunately, I'm not much of an expert in the area. I don't really know too much about it, but I put together some resources, and we'll talk about them later on. So that was Neuromatch 2023. Morgan, did you have any updates? Okay. All right, not yet. That's good. So I think what I'll do is I will go, and actually I want to go through maybe some of the things on Slack. We haven't done that in a long time, just to see what's there and what people are posting. I know there's people see them, but not everyone is a member of every other channel. So Why don't I share my screen? Yeah, and we'll go through some of the stuff. Not having like a list of things that are new in the channels, I'm going to just kind of go through some of these. So brain organoids, I guess we could go back a ways. Morgan's posted a lot of papers in here, so these are like different papers and techniques and different links to things, institutes, things like that. But they're like since June 7th, we have a couple papers. This one here is open source microscopy from June 7th. Scalable to projected light sheet microscopy for high resolution imaging of large samples. So we've talked about light sheet microscopy in DevaWorm, and we've done a lot of analysis of C. elegans embryos that were captured using light sheet microscopy. This is light sheet fluorescence microscopy, so this is a little bit different. This is, of course, not the bright field type of image where it looks kind of black and white, and you see the, a bright field of cells and their different attributes. But it's a fluorescent image where you need a fluorescent marker to show up the different attributes of the cell, the different features of the cell. And so this is something that light sheet microscopy is actually a pretty high resolution technique. So, it's something that gives sharp images. And this is something that they have a low cost and scalable framework for in this paper. So this is a nice, I know Susan in the DevaWorm group does a lot of sort of DIY microscopy. She's done some really impressive work on building like different types of microscopes. This is interesting stuff. This is nice. What is the comment here? Yes. Okay. The second paper is our work on iPSC cell villages, an approach combining cellular genomics, data science, and stem cell research that allows massive scaling of iPSC studies. These are induced pluripotent stem cells, iPSC. This system enables labs to easily run large-scale human genetic studies using iPSC models. So yeah, that's the induced pluripotent stem cells, of course, are where you take transcription factors, you deliver them to the cell with a retrovirus, or sometimes with RNA transfection techniques of some other type, and you can produce stem cells from somatic cells. We've talked about this before. And so, there are different methods that people have worked on. This has been possible for about 15 years. So this is something people have worked on, like efficiency-wise, and, making not only stem cells, but neurons in this fashion. You go from say a skin cell to a neuron. How do you do that? You have to take certain transcription factors and you have to introduce them to the cell. You have to overregulate their production so that there's something going on with, that they're getting the sort of things that they need to trigger the gene regulatory networks that are needed to sort of transition and stabilize the cell to this new fate. So that's great. Then I posted some things here. This was on June 15th. This is stem cell-derived mouse embryos developed within an extra embryonic yolk sac to form anterior brain regions in a beating heart. So in the DevaWorm group, we've been doing a lot of discussion about these virtual embryos or these embryoid models of humans and primates. And there's a lot of exciting work that's been coming out in the last couple months on this. It's been at least 7 or 8 papers on this. So people are really kind of hitting their stride with this stuff. This paper has mouse, but when you're working with embryoids, you have a couple of things. First of all, you don't want to call them embryos, you want to call them embryoids. So it's not like you're making an embryo. You're making a thing that looks like an embryo. And then you're kind of characterizing it, and it doesn't necessarily have every last detail of an embryo. So you basically use the type of approach you would for, say, like an organoid, and you get, maybe like different tissue layers or a yolk sac or other types of structures, a beating heart, and you can do that, but it's not the same thing as an embryo. You can't, say, for example, implant this type of embryo into a uterus and have it grow to be a juvenile, a newborn. The other thing is that you do get some really interesting results in terms of, tissue layering and things like that. So, in some of these models, they get things like anterior brain regions and a beating heart. So they call these ETIX mouse embryos, established from embryonic stem cell aggregated with trophoblast stem cells. So they basically get embryonic stem cells. They could be induced. They could be just harvested from some other source. They put those into sort of the initial condition. They get trophoblast stem cells and put them in there as well. And then they can actually put this in the right medium, and they can stimulate this sort of morphogenesis. So these ETIX mouse embryos can develop their gastrulation and beyond to undertake neural induction and generate the progenitors needed to create the entire organism. So the head folds of the ETIX embryos show anterior expression of OTX2. So anterior means to the back, and this anterior expression defines the forebrain and midbrain regions that resemble those of natural mouse embryo. So, so they look for these different markers in the embryo to see if it's sort of up to what we would expect from a normal embryo. And then this is another paper on this work. So this is something that you'll want to check out if you're interested. This, of course, is referring to what I was talking about, lab-grown human embryo models spark calls for regulation. So as you can imagine, creating human embryos, even in a dish or in a bioreactor, is has a lot of ethical questions, and there have always been ethical questions about cloning and working with stem cells. Some religious, some are just medical ethics. But this is something that we talk about a lot, and of course, it's a whole there are a whole host of issues. I'm not going to get into them right now, but and then this is Carl Zimmer at the New York Times. He wrote this article, "Scientists Debut Lab Models of Human Embryos." This talks about these 7 or 8 papers that have come out about this new technology. Then this is the artificial embryo, the hidden steps in forming a spine. So this is a Nature video. And I found that they use a new term here, axialoid. So we talk about all these different oids. We have embryoids, we have organoids, we have embryoids. As mentioned, embryoids. We have different types of tissue-specific oids. And then there's now axialoid, which means that you're able to create an axial structure. So you can see this. This is forming kind of a notochord, a backbone. It's oriented from anterior to posterior. So you have that structure. So that's what this is about. It's a nice video if you watch it. And then there's some computer chip with built-in human brain tissue gets military funding. So this is this dish brain technology we talked about several months ago now. And this talks about dish brain and how they're able to put some 800,000 human and mouse brain cells into an array of electrodes. So there are electrodes that connect these wells, and you put the cells in a well, and the cells are, they connect with each other and then to the electrodes. And so you can stimulate the neurons in the wells, and they send a signal out, and they're able to sort of establish this closed feedback loop, and they're able to play the game Pong. And this is not a new technology, but the way they approach it is catching some attention. So hello, Raj. Yeah, so that's good, dish brain. I might take a break here from our going over the Slack to ask if Raj has an update for us for GSOC. I know that we didn't have a meeting yesterday because people weren't able.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm currently working on the documentation aspect of the project. I will have the first draft ready by tomorrow and I'll post it in Slack for a review. Apart from that, I plan on doing some fixes in the website and continue my reinforcement learning journey, which I've been paused for my exams.
Yeah, that sounds good. So you've been learning about reinforcement learning.
Yes.
All right. What have you been studying? Like, what areas have you been focusing on?
Like I read some blogs regarding why are they used in real life and what problems do they actually solve. And then I went through some math topics such as Markov chains and Q learning, Q table, and the different various methods that are used in reinforcement learning. And I was trying to assess which method would be best suited for our problem. Currently, I feel Q learning should do the job for us, so I'll look more into that.
That's great. Yeah. Are these published on your Medium that you have for the GSOC?
Not yet. I'll work on it as well.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I look forward to seeing that. We could actually and I'll tell you to do this, but you can push it also to the Orel group Medium too. So I think that would be great. And then, yeah, that's great. So you've been working on reinforcement learning, working on the website, working on some of the documentation, and that we'll be able to review that this coming week or this weekend or whatever. Yeah. That's great. Yeah. Where are you hosting the website?
Currently, I was planning to host it on Vercel because I'm using Next.js for the website, and Next.js is developed and maintained by this organization called Vercel, and they officially have the deployment methods for that. So I'll be hosting it on Vercel.
All right. Yeah, we'll have to figure out a solution for like when the project or when your GSOC period ends. We'll have to figure out a solution for like putting it in the sort of the lab domain. I don't think we have a if you host it on github.io, it's a static server, so that's not necessarily an option, but we'll figure something out, I guess. Yeah, okay. Just making a note here. Anything else?
No, that's it from us.
Okay. What do you plan to do in the next week?
Work on some minor fixes on the website and continue looking into reinforcement.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So thank you for the update. Yeah, so that's great. Yeah, we've had a lot of interest in reinforcement learning, but we've not done a lot of things with it. So that'll be great to see. Maybe you can do something with it before the end of the project period. But even if you don't, that would be good to see. Just to see you get to be exposed to it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for that update, Raj. And I'll go back to we were talking about the Slack channels, and so that was the Brain Organoids channel, and I think that's great that we're continuing to put things in there, and we're kind of developing different threads. So the Diva Worm group has its own set of meetings. They have sort of our own YouTube channel and own set of topics that we talk about, but there's a lot of overlap too between some of the things we talk about here. We've been talking about brain organoids now for like a year and a half in Diva Worm we've had to different papers come up and things like that. So that's always fun to see what people are doing in that area. I think Cognition Futures has been pretty active. So I'll go back a ways. We talk about this a lot in our Cognition Futures reading group meeting, and I've been actually, we record these weekly, and I've been keeping them private for like a year because I didn't, but I've been making some of them public recently. And I've been annotating the YouTube stub. So if you go to the YouTube channel, there are actually some new videos there where we have from, I think, some from recently and some from maybe in the past. So we've been working our way through the ecology of the brain by Fuchs, and been working on some papers with respect to ecological psychology and some other papers as well. And there are a lot of things that we kind of talk about in the meeting. And so this is where a lot of this ends up. So if you see this channel and it looks really robust, we talk about this somewhere else, not just in the Slack. So there's a lot of stuff here. Please join the channel if you're interested. But Jesse's been on this sort of shopping spree, and he lives in Boston, so they have some wonderful bookstores there. And he's been buying books and taking pictures of books, and so it's really some interesting things that he's found over the course of the last maybe 2 months. So he's been finding. This is Representations by Jerry Fodor. That was a book from, on the foundations of cognitive science. This book is The Logic of the Sciences and the Humanities by Northrop. So, there's a lot of philosophy of science that we talk about in our Cognition Futures reading group. A lot of like the history of cognitive science, why it went one way rather than another, and that sort of thing. There's a video by Herb Simon on inventing the future. This was from 1998. So this talks about robotics' growing role in cognitive science. We did Jesse brought up the classic timeline of cognitive science, I think in the Cognition Futures reading group. And we're talking about like the development of different strands of cognitive science. And it's interesting to step back in time and see these different points in time where people have are really gung-ho about a certain thing. And they said, this is a trend. And then you can actually now follow that trend out because we live in the future. And so, you can see where things ended up. Sometimes they end up in an interesting place. Sometimes they end up by the wayside. I think robotics actually it's done a lot of really interesting work, especially with respect to embodied cognition and some of the things that we talk about on a regular basis. So investigating embodied cognition, there's the Hyperot stuff that we saw with the dishes of neurons. There are other types of morphological computing. There's also the xenobots, which are actually frog embryo inspired, and they're actually robots. So there's a lot that we can learn with robotic models in the realm of cognitive science. So we had classics, yeah. And so yeah, we have Jesse and Amanda have a lot of books that they share on the channel, like PDF copies of things that they have in their library, as well as myself. This is the Selfridge Pandemonium model. We've talked about like these demons, and so like this is a thing that it was a theme back in science when they didn't know what a mechanism was. They would call it a demon. So one example is Maxwell's demon, where Clark Maxwell, who of course worked on a lot of the early thermodynamics theory, had this idea that thermodynamics is this random process and it works towards disorder. So everything moves towards disorder over time. And so Maxwell's demon is simply a mechanism by which things do not increase in randomness, but rather increase in order over time. And there's no apparent mechanism other than like some natural process, and so they call that Maxwell's demon because they don't know what it is. It's sort of invoking the supernatural, but it's kind of tongue in cheek. It's like if you were like when they call it mitochondrial Eve in human evolution. It's not they're referring to the Adam and Eve story, but it's not that So this is an example of the pandemonium model. Oliver Selfridge. This was something from the 1950s, where this early cognitive scientist designed this model. What's going on in the brain, and he called it. Was basically called it pandemonium because there's a lot of stuff going on, and at the time they didn't know what the mechanisms were. So obviously they're going to invoke a bunch of demons here, and they're being really cheeky about it. They're just saying that there's this network, there's a bunch of stuff that gets processed. They're probably functional modules, and those functional modules give us something as an output, like it goes from an image to different features of the image, and then to some cognitive domain, and then a decision is made. And we don't really know, at least back in the 1950s, what these mechanisms are. So we'll have a picture of a bunch of demons that some of them are disappointed, some of them are rooting for something to happen, and some are listening intently to the cognitive demons. And so, and there are a lot of different pathways to success, I guess. So this is the way that, this is a nice model because it kind of captures a lot of the complexity of cognition, but it also admits that we don't know, at least back then, what was going on. And so that's an interesting historical aside. But this is, I think, from The Life of Cognitive Science. I'm not familiar with that book, but this kind of goes through the history of cognitive science. Talks about some of the things that people were doing in the 50s with, trying to simulate, build artificial intelligence programs, and how they were characterizing that at the time. Because, the reason that they called it artificial intelligence was because they were trying to model this system of demons that you see here on the left. They were basically trying to figure out what the process was for cognitive processing, how cognition works, and then modeling that with an artificial system. So these demons might be, symbols. It might be a library of symbols. It might be a library of different types of signals, and they put these together in a certain way, and they can create an intelligent system. So this is really kind of talks about the pioneers of artificial intelligence. They were doing a lot of things with finite automata, and so this is classic work. And this is back when they just kind of came up with the term artificial intelligence. And that was kind of a controversial thing at the time. So artificial suggests that the form of intelligence exhibited by computers might differ from that of humans. And indeed, at the time, Minsky and McCarthy, John McCarthy was an early AI person who doesn't get mentioned as much as Minsky, but and so Minsky and McCarthy were not strongly committed to the idea that artificial intelligence would be particularly revealing about human cognition, which is interesting because nowadays people argue that it's so much like human cognition that it's sentient, like at least with respect to large language models. Newell and Simon, who had the only working program, were more concerned with human cognition and were more directed towards psychology. For a number of years, they resisted the label artificial intelligence and referred to complex information processing. So that's an interesting point because we talk about artificial intelligence being like human intelligence or whatever, and it turns out that there was a lot of debate about that very early on in the field and saying, do we want to call this artificial intelligence or do we want to call this information processing or complex information processing? Because the whole point of the cognitive revolution was that you're basically saying that the brain is an information processing machine, that it's a computer that is information processing. That's what it does. It does information processing. So this is a difference, of kind of tone, and people want to make, when you start a new field, you want to get all the sort of the first principles correct. You often don't, but that's what you try to do. And so that's what they're doing here. They're really kind of trying to sort that out. It's interesting that we're still sorting it out even now. So, but this is an interesting point because I think it underpins a lot of the stuff that we've talked about recently with respect to large language models and deep learning and things like that. Yeah, so we just have a lot of stuff in here, a lot of good readings and book covers, and so on and so forth. So yeah, be on the lookout for some of these Cognition Futures reading groups videos that come out. They're just like our meetings there, and sometimes we do a deep dive into a reading. Sometimes we talk about other business, so you may need to fast forward through some parts. Another area we've had, I think I posted a few things in cybernetics recently. This is actually an interesting paper from Jesse, or a Slate magazine article rather. What would the father of cybernetics think about AI today? And so this is the human use of human beings. This is Norbert Weiner. We've actually been doing a reading group on that book, and those sessions are available on the YouTube channel. And this is where we go through this book. The human use of human beings is an interesting book because it talks about a lot of the ethical issues of this sort of artificial intelligence idea, and it has it's very eclectic, I have to say. There are a lot of things he talks about with respect to animal intelligence and human intelligence, and not all of it is correct, I don't think, in the light of what we know now, but it is interesting. And then this paper, Embracing Sensory Motor History, Time Synchronous and Time Unrolled Markov Blankets in the Free Energy Principle. So this is a new paper on the free energy principle and applying it to sensory motor systems. So it's very interesting stuff. Let's see if we have anything else. Yeah, Google Summer of Code, we've been continuing on. That's, of course, Raj and Vishali. And Jesse's also been doing a lot of really interesting discussions about project management and professional development. And Ankit Grover has been attending as well. He's been talking about, he's been helping out with some of the reinforcement learning ideas and things like that. So we meet on Fridays, and this is what we call our open source meeting. So we're doing Google Summer of Code in the summers. We also do open source stuff. We talk about open source stuff. We don't do it so much in off season from Google Summer of Code, but I'd be willing to continue this into the fall if people want to talk more generally about open source software, different things. We have a lot of open source software now in the organization. We've done Google Summer of Code a number of times, so we have a lot of things that get produced that need to be kind of worked with, basically. And you're free to work with it. You're free to, say, download Rajan Brain, which is one of our Brainberg vehicle programs, and you're free to modify that because we have the repository up and improve it. It needs some improvement, but we haven't had anyone interested enough to do those sorts of things. So it would be nice to be able to do that. That's actually attached to a published paper, so that's something we can maybe write another paper on if someone wants to, say, run experiments using it. And so that's an open invitation for people. All right. Information theory has a few things in it here and there. There's a course through the Active Inference Institute on Physics' Information Processing. This is by Chris Fields, and this is ongoing. So this is something that they host and then they put on YouTube. Really interesting. It goes through sort of information processing, information theory, but from a physics perspective. So he talks a lot about quantum information and things like that. I don't know where they are on the course. I saw the first lecture and I haven't caught up with it since, but it might be useful to people. This is something from Morgan. Here's how we could begin decoding an alien message using math. So it's kind of interesting stuff. Then this is about Kirigami antennas. So a couple weeks ago we talked about using, Amanda had found some things about fractal antennas, and we talked about that paper about different models for cognition and how cognition, it doesn't need to be a computer. It could be like a bunch of other things. And one of the possibilities they talked about is the brain specifically as a fractal antenna. And so it's this idea that the brain captures things from the environment and then uses it in cognition. And it's not a computer, it's a sort of a complex geometric thing at many scales that can capture signals and transform them somehow. So that's an interesting idea. I don't know how realistic it is. I mean, they're just metaphors for the brain and for cognition. But then we talked about origami in terms of designing interfaces for haptic interactions. And so that also is, again, something you can put into a technology. It's interesting because it replicates a lot of the aspects um, of haptic interaction and the sense of touch. And so I put this in here this is from Adafruit Industries. They do a lot of stuff with making, which is like, doing it yourself and building things. Artists, designers, and engineers and hackers. This is making Kirigami antennas. So this is Kirigami, which is a different area. It's Japanese folding art. It's like origami, but it's Kirigami. It's a little bit different. And so this is Kirigami antennas are research exploration centered on e-textile metamaterials, designing antennas that are cognizant of their use. So this is something interesting that I don't know. It's just something you might find interesting. So I think that's it. Really I don't think I have too much more in there that's we need to be updated on. But yeah, we do have the Slack, and then we do have the Discord channels, and I'm not going to review those today, but they're there for people to engage with. All right. Any questions at this point? Comments? Okay, if you're interested in joining our Slack, you can. There's a link off of the main website, and you can get an invite there. So, as I mentioned before, we've wrapped up Neuromatch 2023 this week, and that was another successful year. A lot of people got to be exposed to computational neuroscience and deep learning. One of the things, last 2 weeks we've been talking about sort of the open office hours that Conrad Cording has made available. And so he's talked about a number of topics in those sessions, and I kind of covered some of the things. A lot of things to do with large language models, a lot of things to do with some other topics that I can't remember right now. But the last week we didn't really have anything, but there is a lecture in the computational neuroscience course on causality. And so one of the things that we think about a lot in science and in engineering is causality, and specifically how one thing causes another. So we don't really know we can't necessarily capture causality using a standard statistical test. A lot of times we're using tests that are maybe associative or correlative, and they're not causal. So what's the difference between causality and correlation? Correlation means that two things co-occur. Now, just because two things co-occur doesn't mean that one thing causes another. There are a lot of examples in nature of things that you observe, and you observe something else, and then they're not necessarily causal. So, if you watch a crow at dawn and then the sun rises, you might think that the crow causes the sun to rise, when in fact that's not what happens at all. The crow is triggered by the daylight of the pre-dawn period, and then the crow starts to crow, and then the sun rises. And those things are connected, but not in the way that you would assume from that simple observation. So you can see that, like, you could make a correlation between a crow crowing and the sun rising. And if you think that correlation is causation, you could very much make the case for crows or roosters crowing, making the sun rise. And so that's not the way it works, though. We know that from like a deeper understanding of the problem and a deeper set of observations. So causality really is that. It's understanding the system, making a deeper set of observations around the phenomena you're interested in, and then building a model that captures that. So there are a lot of spurious correlations. There's a site on the web, Spurious Correlations, where they give a bunch of different types of correlations, and they show the correlation, which is actually very strong. But obviously, those, like, they'll make up ridiculous examples of two things that are related with statistical correlations, but have nothing to do with one another causally. So that's kind of why we're interested in this. And indeed, if you look at a lot of models, predictive models, they'll kind of come up with associations that are interesting, but they're not particularly informative from a causal standpoint. So, like, one of the examples from very early machine learning was the beer and diapers issue. So what they would do is they'd take like data from like a supermarket and they'd run it through an algorithm. They'd find like the different associations between things. So you'd have people would buy things in together on the same bill, and so they found that a lot of people were buying beer and diapers at the same time, and so it doesn't it wouldn't make immediate connection in someone's head that those two things are being bought together, but they found out that they were being bought together, and so you can make that association, but you can't say that there's any causality there. You can't say anything about the profile of the customer that causes them to do that. You can make assumptions, but you have to have a deeper model there of why they're doing that kind of behavior. And so that was something that's often been missing from like machine learning and deep learning, is this a model of a deeper set of mechanisms. And it goes back to the demons example that I gave earlier, that we kind of, in a lot of deep learning and machine learning models, we're really dealing with demons in a sense. We don't know the mechanism of the things that we're observing. So we observe some relationships or correlation. We don't know what the mechanism is necessarily. And of course, we see this in bioinformatics too, where you have like a set of associations between like, maybe like genes and different functions in the cell or in the organism. And, we can make some observations, we can make some guesses, but we can't, maybe we have to do other things like some sort of gene regulatory network modeling or other things to really get a handle on what the function actually is. So this is a problem that is I think, very relevant to a lot of areas of statistical models. And it's certainly something to think about. So I'm going to go through some resources right now on this. So Wikipedia, of course, has a stub on causal models. And this is kind of the starting point, I think, for understanding the difference, at least from a modeling standpoint, between correlation and causation. So in the philosophy of science, they've used causal models for a long time, and of course it can be transferred to statistical models, statistical learning, and other things. So a causal model, or a structure causal model, is a conceptual model that describes the causal mechanisms of a system. Causal models can improve study designs by providing clear rules for deciding which independent variables need to be included or controlled for. So this is where you have your independent variables and your dependent variables. So, in a typical statistical test, we usually have our independent variable x and our dependent variable y. This is usually like a regressor to y or something like that. But basically, this is a thing that you might vary, and then this is the thing you're testing against. So x and y are related on a graph like this. X is here, y is here, and you have this line. And if you vary x, you get a corresponding response in y.
Hello. Bradley, the screen share is not visible.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So this is, all right. So yeah, this is x and y, and then this is the relationship between x and y. But you can see it's not causal, it's just kind of like x is related to y in this fashion. You could say x causes y, but you'd be missing out like on a whole bunch of hidden variables that might be here influencing y. So aside from x, you might have some other variables here that are also exerting influence on y. So maybe this isn't a linear thing. Maybe this is kind of like a curved thing. It could be modeled with some sort of polynomial. And now when you look at different points in x, it's not as clear, you have different values of y, but it's not as clear that x has an effect on y in the same way. And so, causality means like what's causing the effect on y? How do you explain the value of y given the value of x, or given the value of whatever inputs you're getting to y? And this is, a question, sometimes this is a very philosophical question because, aside from like all these boxes and arrows, we don't really know what the causal mechanism is. And then we don't know if there are feedbacks from other things. There could be things downstream of y, for example, that feed back to y, that influence y at the same time point. Or, this could be z, I guess. And then that feeds back to y. And then that's acting in concert with the other inputs and affecting the value of y. So that's what we're dealing with causal modeling. We're basically creating these boxes and arrows models. We're looking at the effect on some target variable, and then we're measuring it in some way, and we're making a statement about what the causal structure is. So all these boxes are different variables that we might measure in the real world. And it's a network that we can build, and you'll see that there are different examples of networks that can be used to get at this problem. So causal models can help with the question of external validity, whether the results of one study can apply to unstudied populations. So again, if we have just the x and the y relationship, the linear relationship, it may or may not transfer to other types of systems. Now, a causal model may not do that either, but it's a little bit easier to understand. Like, if you understand the underlying structure of what's influencing y instead of just a single variable, then you get a sense of how these things, can be applied more broadly to population. So, Judea Pearl, we're going to talk about Judea Pearl, and his work is seminal in a lot of the causality stuff. He defines a causal model as an ordered triple, UVE, where U is a set of exogenous variables, which are determined by factors outside the model. V is a set of endogenous variables, which are determined by factors within the model. And E is a set of structural equations that express the value of each endogenous variable as a function of the values on the other variables in U and V. So he has this triplet that he talks about, and there's kind of goes through a very formal relationship for, it's basically things within the set of relationships you're modeling, things outside that set of relationships, and then you have structural equations that sort of relate those things. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has an article on causal models. So I don't know who wrote this, but the author, they have it listed. It'd be kind of nice to know who that is. Let's see. There are a lot of nice references here, but I don't think they really give the author here. But they basically cite a lot of Pearl. They cite a lot of other people here. Um, and they also have an entry on causation and manipulability. So this is something that has a number of other sort of stubs. Another one is counterfactual theories of causation. So considering counterfactuals, so if you say X is related to Y, um, and causes an effect, is this in contrast to some other relationship that you can map with Y? Is Z affecting Y in a way that has the same kind of effect, or is it a different effect? And so you can actually add in counterfactuals that compare one thing with another. So we do that sort of with controls and experiments. We have like this relationship, and we see that it does something, and then we want to see if a control does the same thing or if it's maybe like less effective. And so this is something that we do all the time in experiments and in analysis, but we don't we don't structure it in a way that really can inform us about the causality. So in this article, they talk about causal models. They talk about the basic tools. You have you have to use a lot of logic. There's a lot of like kind of mathematical expressions that one can use. Then we use a lot of probability theory. So there are a lot of probabilities. And then graphs, of course. And I was showing you kind of some examples of sort of the origins of graphs here, where we have a lot of inputs and a single output, perhaps of feedback. And those can actually evolve to things called deterministic structural equation models, which I'm not going to talk about today, but they're basically these graphical models that are similar to that, where you can model out these kind of relationships. There are also probabilistic causal models, which are very similar in a lot of ways. They're structural equation models with random errors. And each box is kind of like, you can use Markov processes within them. You can use other types of processes to model different variables that you can't observe. You model the things that you can observe. You have different latent variables. And then you can actually do some, or you can actually also use counterfactuals. And then you can use causal discovery with these kind of models. So these are two models that are kind of network-like structural equation models and probabilistic causal models. And so they go through some of that in the article. But really, if you want to get a sense of that, I would go to some other references. There's a course online. This is Daphne Kohler. This is probabilistic graphical models. This is one of the. This class is pretty old. It's been around for a while. Basically, they walk through a lot of the things that you need to know for setting up these models and running them. They make use of Bayesian networks a lot, so they're actually doing like Bayesian. These boxes and arrows are Bayesian relationships, conditional probabilities, things like that. And that's sort of a representation of the problem. We do a lot of things with Markovian models and random processes. Then there's inference. So you're doing inference in different ways. There's learning, causation, which is where you're dealing with decision theory and utility functions. You're also modeling perfect information and the application of decision models to different domains in the world. So there's a lot of stuff to learn for that. Then there's this article. This is from Medium, a step-by-step guide in detecting causal relationships using Bayesian structure learning in Python. So this is an article on kind of how to implement some of Bayesian structure learning, which is another method for detecting causality. As you can tell, there's some methods that are well established and methods that are not well established. So, there's some methods that kind of grew out of the needs of statistical analysis. So, like, if you're analyzing a data set, you need to have a method for sort of extracting causal relationships. And in machine learning and deep learning and other areas like that, there's a different set of methods because it's a different set of challenges. You don't have that sort of experimental structure, or you have, like, you're trying to make it a sort of a general purpose tool. So this article kind of talks about determining causality across variables. I will summarize the concept of causal models in terms of Bayesian probabilistic, which means they're using a Bayesian model, Bayesian approach, followed by a hands-on tutorial to detect causal relationships using Bayesian structure learning. So this is a Python library, bnlearn, that he's using for this. And so basically, the reason you want to discover causality, you want to be able to, say, extract causal relationships with some target variable, as I mentioned on the Jamboard here. That this is, y is your target variable, and you have a bunch of intervening variables that have some effect on y, and that's what you want to characterize. But you don't want to just say that something is having some influence on y where it's, in cases where it's spurious, where it just kind of co-occurs. In other words, which variables have a direct causal effect on the target variable? Some insights are important to determine the driving factors that reach the conclusion, and as such, strategic actions can be taken. So it talks about Bayesian probabilistic graphical models or Bayesian networks. So Bayesian networks are basically these probabilistic graphical models using a Bayesian kernel, or using a Bayesian approach. So he talks about correlation and association here, where those are kind of weak relationships, as opposed to causality, which is a strong relationship. So the observed relationships between two variables does not necessarily mean one causes the other. Correlation refers to a linear relationship between two variables, whereas association refers to any relationship between two or more variables. But causation means that one variable, often called the predictor variable or independent variable, which is x in this diagram, causes the other, often called the outcome variable or the dependent variable, which is y. And so this is, in the next two sections, I will briefly describe correlation and association by example. So he kind of goes through this, showing this chocolate consumption and Nobel laureate relationship. So if you're, apparently in this graph, if you were just to take this at face value, countries with a lot of Nobel laureates also have high chocolate consumption. Therefore, chocolate consumption causes you to be a Nobel laureate, which is ludicrous, but that's what this tells you, just at face value. And so we want to know a little bit more about this relationship. Maybe it's just spurious, maybe it's just a coincidence, maybe there's something, it just co-occurs. I mean, there are probably no good reasons for this, but, we don't want to take these kind of graphs at face value. We want to have a causal model to tell us whether this is spurious, a coincidence, or whether it has some causal structure. And this is where networks come in, because we can test a bunch of different variables. They could be latent variables. They could be things that we can measure. And so this is what we're doing in causal modeling. So this is an example of a directed acyclic graph. And this kind of encodes a lot of these models. So what we do is we have a graph that goes in time from top to bottom. So we have a DAG is usually something that is ordered. So we'll have something ordered in time. If we think about like a causal relationship, like A causes B causes C. And we can think of examples like this in the brain. I mean, or in behavior. So if I have like if there's a stimulus here, it causes some sort of brain activity. And then there is a response, a behavioral response. This is very behaviorist, but And then of course there's also the response also can influence the next stimulus. And it maybe also influences brain activity depending on what the response is. So there are a lot of feedbacks here too. but you see that what we're interested in is the sort of the directed aspect of this graph. And so that's the directed aspect, is it's directed in time, all right? It's directed towards like the future. So like A causes, B causes C. A is in the past, B is in the present, C is in the future. We can map that out and we can order it, and we can put in maybe intervening variables to say that this thing causes this thing causes this thing. It's not some other relationship, but it's this relationship. That's where the counterfactual comes in. It's not like there's some intervening variable that hits B and then it goes to another intervening variable. And this just happens to be like a coincidental relationship. We can actually tease this out as the real relationship, but it has to be directed in time. There's also this term acyclic. And acyclic means that there are no cycles in this graph. So I added in some feedbacks. Those feedbacks are cyclic, meaning that there's a cycle that one can build from A to B to C and then to A. So you don't want to have a cycle. So a cycle is just kind of like where you can make a loop and return back to the original variable. So A to B to C, then back to A. That's a cycle. And we don't want those in a causal model because we want to just get the sequence of events, whether those sequence of events cause one another. We may have feedbacks, but we're not interested in them right now. And then, of course, a graph is just this graphical relationship. So that's what we mean by DAG. And they use the term DAG a lot in causal modeling because that's very much the currency of it. So this is an example of DAGs encoding conditional independencies. So this X, Z, Y, X is, X influences Y, but it's conditional upon Z. So X and Z combined to affect Y. Y and Z then can also maybe affect X. So this is, so they give these letters here. They have these conditional independencies. A, B, and C are what they call equivalence classes. So you can organize these in different ways. So like, and this is a way that you can look at like kind of the effect, whether it's like specific to a certain variable or whether you can recombine them. So in other words, X and Z affect Y, but Y and Z can also affect X. And this is getting at the feedback thing. So, maybe they're reciprocal there's reciprocal causality in some cases. That's okay. We just want to model it as an ordered set. So sometimes these are equivalent. Sometimes it doesn't matter the order in which something happens, but it has an effect nonetheless. That's what an equivalence class is. A and B here are cascades, meaning that you go from X to Z to Y. There's this cascading action that it goes through different variables, and that if you took out Z entirely, then you probably wouldn't have a causal relationship between X and Y. That's what the cascade means. It has this sort of cascading quality. C is common parent, meaning that Z has an effect on both X and Y. So again, it's acyclic. It goes in one direction, but it branches to X and Y. So, you might have like a mother cell, developmental lineage tree. We use this in DevaWorm a lot. And then that cell has an effect on both children. So X and Y can both be infected by Z in different ways or maybe in the same way. And so that's, we can't build this cascade because it's a different relationship. And then D is a special class of V structure. So this is where X and Y both affect Z. And you can disentangle these effects just by testing X versus testing Y. They're both contributing to Z. They have like an effect size. Each of them have an effect size on Z. And then you have to model those independently to disentangle it. So I'm not going to talk anymore about that paper but I think that's a good reference if you're interested in learning about this. This is the book Causality by Judea Pearl. This was published in 2000, and he goes through a lot of these models with sort of painstaking detail. So this is a little bit dated, but I think a lot of things he talks about holds true today. People draw from this book all the time, so you'll see it again and again when people talk about causality. He kind of goes through like probability theory, graphs and probabilities, causal Bayesian networks, and functional causal models. So these are all the different models we talked about. Then there's this theory of inferred causation. So how do you infer causation? There are principles like Occam's razor you can use, which is the simplest explanation is the best. There are structures like DAGs that we use as a way to sort of isolate the variables and make sure we understand the sort of the order of operations. But then sometimes in some systems we have non-local causation and other things like that. So we have to think about our system that we're measuring. And so maybe DAGs in some cases aren't the best tool to look at causality, but often they are. And so this is then we can have causal diagrams and understanding different causal effects. So, we use graphs as models of interventions. We use these DAGs in much the same way that an experimentalist will use an experimental setup or an experimental design. You're not really modeling the real world. You're modeling like sort of a model of the real world. So you're kind of giving a stilted view of the world, but you need to do that to get these relationships down. There are other things he talks about, actions, plans, and direct effects. There are a lot of wonderful topics for like investigating social science and economics. And I would add cognitive science. He doesn't talk about cognitive science here, but I think that there are a lot of interesting things to say about causality or the study of causality in cognitive science, especially with respect to some of the things that we talked about the history of artificial intelligence and like some of the work that was done there. It'd be wonderful to have a conversation around causality and some of the things around cognition. So yeah, and then there are two other papers here: Causality for Machine Learning, which is a paper specifically about how the machine learning community uses the idea of causality. And they draw, like I said, largely from the work of Judea Pearl and some of these other things. For a long time, people in machine learning didn't use causal models. So we had things like the beer and diapers problem, which was, basically interesting relationship, but maybe it was good for like marketing people to study like how people buy things together, but they don't tell us anything about like say consumer behavior in general. So people have been applying causality more directly to this area. This article argues that the hard open problems of machine learning and AI are intrinsically related to causality, and that explains how the field is beginning to understand them. So this is kind of an interesting take on it. Again, like I said, it has a lot to do with generalization. You can say things, you can make an observation between a rooster and the sun rising, where people buying beer and people buying diapers in the same purchase, but it tells you nothing about like whether that's actually there's a deeper model there, a deeper sort of causality, or whether it's just a coincidence, or whether it's just kind of an interesting thing that has no relevance to the anything else in the world. And so this kind of goes through. This is sort of an advocacy for using causality in machine learning. There are specific domain issues there that I don't know if they talk about too much here, but it should be a good read. What is the date on this paper? In 2019, so it's pretty current. Then there's this paper by Heckman, and this is the scientific model of causality. And this paper actually is a bit older, I think, but I think it's a book chapter. So, but it does talk about kind of like how traditionally the scientific community thought about causality. And it wasn't necessarily using graphical models. It was just kind of thinking about causality versus correlation. So this is, there's a definition of causality in science that we've kind of have embraced. It's hard to define causality without lapsing into tautology. So that's another thing you have to, in the spirit of causality, you don't want your definition to be self-referential. You want to have like something where you can actually get to like cause and effect and not have cause, effect, cause. So two ingredients are central to any definition. One is a set of possible outcomes or counterfactuals. So there are these different scenarios. Does this thing cause it or this other thing? And then those things have to be considered separately and then together. So you have to say, if, I have a hypothesis about A being related to B, or X being related to Y, as we see here in number one. Why is it not that Y is related to Z? We don't know. It could be that X is related to Y, right? But could it just as easily be that Y is related to Z in the same way? It produces the same output. And so if we graph X and Y, we graph Y and Z, and then we end up graphing maybe X and Z, they all seem to have the same sort of outcome. So in a sense, our model is useless because everything we model is the same effect, right? So we say X and Y have an effect. There's a causal mechanism there. Well, Y and Z and X and Z also have the same outcome. So they either maybe have the same causal structure underlying them, or maybe it's a different causal structure. We're not really getting at causality. So these are counterfactuals. And we model these counterfactuals as a way sort of to rule out sometimes these sets of relationships. So we can say that, okay, X and Y are causally related. Well, how can we know this? Well, we know that Y and Z are not causally related because we test them and they don't come up with, a relationship that makes sense. X and Z, we can do the same thing and it doesn't. So these are our counterfactuals, right? The counterfactuals then are compared to our main hypothesis. So we've considered the alternatives and we've determined that X and Y is the best fit to the model that we're using. And so this is where we kind of have to make these decisions about, what we're saying is causal and what we're saying is not. And then two is a manipulation where one or more of the factors or determinants is changed. So now we might have a situation, and this is much like an experimental design problem where you have maybe some, you might have a relationship where you say, X causes Y, right? But what if I were to replace Y with Z? And this is not a counterfactual. This is just kind of like replacing things. What is the effect? Does it have the same effect? Or if I have a 3-tiered thing where it's X, Z, Y. And this is if you think about this in Bayesian terms, it's basically Y equals X given Z or something like that, where you have this, conditional variable in here that has, it's X but given Z also, and then Y. And then if I just take Z out, and I say maybe X given M is Y. So I want to maybe change that conditional a little bit. And what's the output? Is it the same or is it different or what? So you make these different considerations. And it's like an experiment where you might replace one thing with another, or you might reduce the thing that's supposed to have an effect, and you'll see what the difference is between them. So this is what they're arguing. An effect is realized as a change in the argument of a stable function that produces the same change in the outcome for a class of interventions that change the factors by the same amount. So basically, it's like in a control condition, you might have no effect. In an experimental condition, you might have an effect of a certain size. And then I can say that my intervention had an effect of a certain size, and it's due to that intervention in nothing else. That's what you're saying. The outcomes are compared to different levels of factors or generating variables. Holding all factors save one at a constant level, the change in the outcome associated with manipulation of the varied factor is called a causal effect of the manipulated factor. So this goes back in time. This goes back to Mill and some other people. This has been around for like 150 years. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes causality is not linear. Sometimes it's circular, and by design, it's circular causality. That's a different thing. I'm not going to talk about that right now. But this is basically a linear causality, and they actually talk about this in the econometric tradition. So this kind of talks about how this is applied to a certain field. This maybe is less interesting to a cognitive science crowd, but it does talk about some of these things, with respect to how they're applied. So the term counterfactual is taken from the philosophical definition. Hypothetical is also basically the same thing. So you have these hypothetical scenarios that you compare with the scenario you're measuring, just to make sure that you're on the right track. So they go through a lot of things here. The rest of the things I'm going to kind of go over very briefly are interesting, but they're not central to the idea. So this is This is a lot of stuff in this folder dealing with time series. So this is detecting and quantifying causal associations in large nonlinear time series data sets. So this goes beyond maybe like something like brain data to complex dynamical systems. So things in earth science or things in medicine. So they kind of talk about some of these independence tests that we talked about. They have a causal discovery algorithm that allows them to estimate things on these causal networks. And this is using time series data, so it's a little bit different way of doing it, but it uses a lot of the same tools. This paper is Incorporation of Causality Structures to Complex Network Analysis on Time-Varying Behavior of Multivariate Time Series. So this is a new methodology for characterizing evolving behavior of time-varying causality. So there's this idea of time-varying causality, which means we have that basic causal structure, but it varies over time. That mechanism changes with respect to time. So you can see that there are a lot of challenges to this basic model of causality that we deal with. And we have to kind of have new models for those, but they kind of draw from the traditional models. So it's kind of interesting here how they're dealing with this. So these are just like special cases of causality. Then there's methods for interaction. These papers deal with a general model-based causal inference method overcomes the curse of synchrony and indirect effect. So like this paper deals with sort of synchrony and indirect effects and some aspects of circular causality. So there's this technique in brain neuroimaging it's largely applied to neuroimaging, called Granger causality, which is where you have two time series and there's sort of a lag introduced. And so in Granger causality, it's kind of like you have X and Y, and there are these two strings basically that are ordered in time. So your time series, right? This is FT1, this is FT2. And the idea is that you want to figure out the effect of X on Y. So what you'll do is each time point, you'll try to map it to the other function. So for example, you might take X and you might start at 0.5. And then you introduce a lag in Y of 5. And so that means you're looking at the first point in Y. So the idea is that the effect of X has an effect on Y, but it's delayed. And so the idea is that this will predict this, but it's like basically it could be the cumulative effect of all 5 points has an effect on Y. Or it could be like this, where you have like 0.1 has an effect on 0.5 of Y. So you can make these kind of statements where you introduce some lag factor. and that lag factor is a hypothesis about the sort of the delayed causality. So the idea is that if I introduce some intervention here at 1, it won't have an effect in y until 0.5. But then after 0.5, it should have you have to pick the right lag factor. You have to figure out what the lag factor is here. Sometimes this is actually like kind of almost like a retrocausality. I don't know why I introduced that, but it might be an interesting case too. But the point being is that you can sort of synchronize these two time series with some sort of delay factor. The effect is not immediate. It's not like 1-to-1. It would be like you could have like a lag of 1. It's like if I do something in X, it's reflected in the next time point of Y. That would be more like sort of a evolution equation or a set of interacting differential equations. So like, 1 has an effect on 2, and then maybe 2 has an effect on 3 if you do this, and then 3 has an effect on 4. So, I mean, there are a lot of ways you can set this up. But that's the idea. You introduce a lag between two time series. So that's Granger causality. It's flexible model. It's a flexible model, and it does give you some information about like temporal lag and the effects of things. So you're not just looking at a correlation. You're looking at like the effects of time on two time series. But however, they have difficulty distinguishing synchrony and indirect effects from direct causation. So you can have indirect effects get introduced there. You have issues of synchrony. For example, if your time series aren't synchronized, that can screw up your analysis. And so this is a common criticism of Granger causality. To overcome this model-based inference methods that test the reproducibility of data with specific mechanistic models to infer causality were developed. So they kind of talk about this, they use this general ODE-based inference or GOBI method, and that's what they're proposing here. So there are a lot of different ways you can model this. This is partial cross-mapping, eliminates indirect causal influences. So this again is where they're trying to address these indirect causal influences and isolate the direct causal influences from them. So causality detection likely misidentifies indirect causations as direct ones due to the effect of causation transitivity, which is what we talked about kind of in this example here, where it was in one of the other papers, but it's basically where you order these in different ways. And, you have feedback between the first one and the last one. Okay, this example is better. So transitivity would be where A causes B and B causes C. But if you have a feedback loop between C and A, then that's not necessarily transitivity. This is transitive. A causes B, B causes C. But sometimes you have these feedback loops in play that screw up that transitivity. So you want strong transitivity, and that's what they're getting at here. The challenging situation where the variables of the underlying dynamical system are non-separable, meaning that the variables aren't independent, they're kind of overlap. So it's hard to draw like a relationship between them if they overlap, because you'll have these interactions. So here we solve the problem by developing a data-based model-independent method, a partial cross-mapping between an articulated integration of 3 tools from nonlinear dynamics and statistics: phase-based reconstruction, mutual cross-mapping, and partial correlation. So they're doing these fancy tools that kind of give you some ways around some of these problems. And then finally, Bayesianism, and this is just examples of Bayesian applications to this, where they incorporate causality structures to a complex network analysis. A complex network analysis introduces this non-transitivity a lot of times. And so this is a problem that, can be solved in different ways. This is a review of Pearl's book Causality. This is from, I think, 2003, and it talks about this in the context of econometrics. So I don't know how many people here know anything about econometrics, but this kind of talks about it this is a very general review, so kind of reviews the book and gives some, sketches out some of the ideas, and it kind of critiques his point of view, Pearl's point of view. Pearl's a computer scientist, so he does a lot of stuff from that perspective. It's not necessarily philosophical, it's not necessarily econometric, but it is sort of the computer science approach. Then there's this article by Judea Pearl, and it's a book report or a technical report of some type, and it's titled Bayesianism and Causality, or Why I'm Only a Half Bayesian. So he talks about this as like his faith in Bayesianism, and some people might call it a religion, but definitely he says that he's still a Bayesian. However, in order to be combined with data, our knowledge must be first be cast in some formal language. And what I've come to realize in the past 10 years is that the language of probability is not suitable for the task. The bulk of human knowledge is organized around causal, not probabilistic relationships, and the grammar of probability calculus is insufficient for capturing these relationships. So the context here is that Judea Pearl will introduce something called do calculus, which is a specific thing to look at causality. It's a specific type of calculus, and it kind of gets at this problem he's posing here. So specifically, the building blocks of our scientific and everyday knowledge are elementary facts such as mud does not cause rain, and symptoms do not cause disease. And those facts, strangely enough, cannot be expressed in the vocabulary of probability calculus. It is for this reason I consider myself only a half Bayesian. So this is interesting because he kind of points out that really causality isn't about just pure statistical will. It's about sort of the philosophy of the construct, how you build a network of concepts that you would test the idea of something being causally related to another. At some level, it has to be like about variable construction and concept construction as well. So that's something that maybe we can talk about in the future. But that's what I wanted to talk about with respect to causality. So any questions about that? Any comments? Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, I can make the readings available. So that concludes our sort of parallel track um, with Neuromatch. And so, yeah. So let me go on to some other things here. So this week, let me share my screen. So this week was the Alife conference. It was hosted in Japan, Sapporo, Japan. I didn't go, but I heard it was pretty good. I might review it later, maybe next week. But they do, they have a lot of interesting things at Alife. They do a lot of, things with like cellular automata and artificial life, like, genetic algorithms and other types of evolving systems. And then they do other kinds of things. They're interested in sort of the intersection between machine learning and Alife techniques, or in this case, the ghost and the machine. They're interested in cognition in Alife. And so there was a lot of stuff on that. They also do things with like protocells and looking at very simple living systems. We talked last week about, or in the last few weeks, about Andy Adamatsky's work, and he's done a lot of stuff in the Alife community. So it's really, this is where we're kind of looking at the potential of life to tell us about artificial systems, to understand the evolution of life or the evolution of artificial systems, and maybe even the evolution of life as well. One of the things that I was able to get from one of the authors here, let me go back, is this paper. This is a brand new paper in the journal Artificial Life. This is an editorial, and this is really about artificial life as a field and large language models and generative AI. So this is Alan Doran and Susan Stepney. They're both pretty well versed in that field. And so they kind of talk about large language models and generative AI and sort of this idea of artificial life. So artificial life is not AI. It's a very different mode of inquiry. We talked about AI being sort of complex information processing. Artificial life is simulating sort of natural processes, understanding the evolution of life in a computational environment. So it's a very different enterprise. But nevertheless, there is this kind of relationship that's interesting. So we're interested in large language models and generative artificial intelligence, and it's really raised a bunch of questions about the potential and implications of generative algorithms and the ethical use of AI generated text in a variety of contexts. This includes open science, student assessment, and medicine, which are really interesting, and I don't know what these references are, but we'll have to look them up later. Similarly, among the graphic and visual arts communities, the use of generative image synthesis like DALL-E, Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion that take text prompts and produce works of art, which is maybe something that is, considered to be creative or not, but it's causing a lot of consternation and posing challenging questions. And so this kind of raises two questions for the authors, or actually, I guess, three. The first is, can AI generate documentary evidence that is indistinguishable from reality? In other words, if I generate a piece of art using, say, like Midjourney, can I know that it was generated by an AI? Or maybe I can't tell whether it was generated by an AI or by a human. So this almost sounds like a Turing test sort of thing, where we have a Turing sort of a Turing test maybe, but it's not. They don't really pose it in those terms. But in any case, that's one problem. The second is, how is the concept of truth confused or undermined by the output of these technologies? Is it ethical to load examples of a human's art to generate a model for replicating their style? So these are just kind of, that's an issue of sort of truth, and then ethics. And then three, who owns the intellectual property rights of AI-generated artifacts? And, there are a lot of things associated with that. So I guess, let's see what they talk about with respect to artificial life. Now they get into like artificial life in the journal, in MIT Press journals. They have a policy for generative AI. Any use of generative AI for any part of a submitted work, including but not limited to text, images, sound, data, mathematics, logic, reasoning, programming, or algorithms, must be prominently, explicitly, and unambiguously labeled and its source formally cited. So, and also, they have they have rules about LLMs. They try to limit the use of large language models. Springer Nature has a zero tolerance policy, but that's for authorship, and so that's something also that needs to be transparent. So I guess the other thing they point to here is that this is something that we've dealt with before in artificial life. There is a precedent for such work, much of which has been explored under the banners of cybernetic, generative, and artificial life art. So this is stuff that's been done, even back in the 70s, but more recently in the 2000s and 2010s. So there is precedent for this, for making things that are generative. I mean, the artificial life community has been doing this for many years. They create, like, say, a genetic algorithm. The output of the genetic algorithm then is maybe they have an art track at the Artificial Life Conference. So the art track has a lot of this stuff where they create like a genetic algorithm that can generate different types of art, and then that's computer-generated art. And this has been going on for years. In such contexts, the art is published. Associated commentary and explanations may come later, and these may not be authorized by the same system or person who made the original work. So, chatbots go back to the 1960s with Alicea. So we've had chatbots for a long time too. But this is something that, the standards are rolling out there in mainstream society. But the point here is that we have some precedent for this. So I'm not sure we really get into any sort of strong connections between like Alife and generative AI, other than some of these issues with producing, things that are, So after that run of special issues, we welcome you back to a general issue of contributed research articles. This is a set of articles here they talk about, and that's the end of the paper. So that's kind of like an editorial, but I thought that was interesting. Another thing here I want to talk about with respect to these type of models is there's this thing that came out, this interesting paper, and I'm not sure if it's actually like on the up and up, but I'm going to go through it. So this is a paper on using an algorithm called gzip. And gzip is actually a piece of code. It's a 14-line piece of code that uses gzip that can be used to understand similarities between sentences. So this is kind of relevant to this whole thing with large language models, because we make a big deal about how large language models are very similar to sort of human language, and can understand human language. And people are philosophizing about how it might be sentient. But this is kind of an interesting thing, because you can build a very simple piece of software that does basically what a large language model can do, but in 14 lines of code using gzip. So this is where Python, this is the code for Python text classification with gzip. This is the overall approach. And then they actually have some results in the paper. So this is an example of the overview here. It's basically a series of compressors, and then they compute a distance, and then that distance is used to determine sort of, have some sort of understanding of language. So this is the paper here, where this is actually, I think this is a blog post on the paper. So this is decoding the ACL paper, gzip and KNN rival BERT and text classification. So this is where this is a paper that came out, I think, in the ACL, at the ACL conference. A new paper published at this year's edition of the prestigious ACL conference for natural language processing has gone viral among the researchers. The paper shows that using a combination of gzip and k-nearest neighbor to classify text achieves performance on par with state-of-the-art models, including BERT. At a time when much of the research work is being published is centered around large language models, this innovative approach provides a refreshing perspective. The paper, although only 10 pages long in a 2-column format, is not a straightforward read. I have decided to compose a series of 2 articles to dissect the paper. The first article of the series, this piece, aims to demystify the paper's crucial findings using layman's terms, and then the subsequent article will dig deep into why the approach works, what implications it has for the future research in NLP, and more detailed aspects of the study. So I remember like a couple months ago they were saying that NLP was dead because large language models would take over. But now we're seeing that maybe that's not entirely true, that there are a lot of methods that one can use to get at some of these problems. So they kind of talk about how all supervised machine learning strategies are grounded on various forms of mathematical models. These models consist of some unknown parameters which need to be learned by a training. For example, linear regression is based on the following model. This model here, this is a simple linear regression model. x equals a, or y equals ax plus b, and then with some factor here, where x and y are the input sample and its output from the training data, while a and b are the unknown parameters or weights in the model, which need to be learned through the process of training. So this is where, this is a very simple model. And then this paper that I'm referring to in terms of gzip also uses k nearest neighbors for classification. So it basically is this algorithm that is very simple. You can write it in 14 lines of code, and it can do its performance rivals more complex methods. So the approach proposed by the paper is very simple and can be described in the following steps. So to classify sample T, if I give you a sample T, you compress T using gzip, so you compress the information. Then for each sample S in the training data set, you compress S using gzip as well, so you compress T and S. Then you compute the distance between gzip S and gzip T. So you're basically doing, I think, a lossless compression of these two inputs. Or you'll have sample T, and then for each sample S, you'll compress both of those, and then you'll compute a distance. And then 3 is find the k nearest neighbors for T based on the distances computed in 2.2. And then 4, pick the majority class as the target label from the k neighbors. And then the question comes down to how you compute the distance between two compressed documents, and that's what they're doing. So I have a question or a comment in the chat. Okay, yeah, this is interesting paper, yeah. So this paper, there was some criticism of it. And I don't know if I have the criticism in here, but this is the paper itself. And this is a group of people from the University of Waterloo in Canada. And it's called Low Resource Text Classification, a parameter-free classification method with compressors. So they're using gzip to compress. They're using a simple method to classify the distance between the compressions, and that's basically it. So, they kind of point out that DNNs can be computationally intensive, requiring millions of parameters and large amounts of labeled data, which can make them expensive to use, to optimize, and to transfer out of distribution cases. So you can't necessarily deal with these out of distribution cases, or what we might call outliers, using DNNs. They're not robust to those. And so there's a whole area dealing with that aspect of it. But in this paper, we propose a non-parametric alternative to DNNs that's easy, lightweight, and universal in text classification. A combination of a simple compressor like gzip with a k-nearest neighbor classifier. And so this is where they get BERT-like performance, or even outperforms BERT on out-of-distribution data sets, including 4 low-resource languages. So when you have things that aren't well sampled or don't occur a lot in the training set, you can do better. Our method also excels in the few-shot setting, where labeled data are too scarce to train DNNs effectively. So their code is available at this Bazinga Gen NPC gzip. That's the address of the GitHub repository. And then they kind of talk about some of their results. Now, there were some criticisms of this paper. Let me go through the rest of this folder. This is, that's a different thing. This is actually something that's interesting with respect to neural networks, though. This is a tweet about, and this is what that other paper was about that I just opened. This is the author, one of the authors of the paper. Neural networks are not a silver bullet. We also use the well-established metrics proposed by Kolmogorov and others to detect an imitation in the growth of natural texts and computer codes. GPT is an implementation of past principles and not a replacement. This was actually at NetSci 2023, which happened last month. So what they're doing here is basically a very similar thing to gzip, and this is why I'm including it in this, is that they're looking at this Kolmogorov complexity is basically like a similar thing to what we were talking about with the gzip example, where you're finding a distance and you're calculating complexity based on a distance in a computer code. So they're actually looking at the distance between natural text and computer codes. And this is a graph from their paper. This is where they look at a Kolmogorov complexity, the compressibility, and the lexical diversity of Atari versus VIC-20, which are two computer game systems from the 1980s. And they're looking at the accumulated symbol count. And then this is over time, I think 1982, 1984. And then the exponent of the power law. And this is accumulated word count in terms of compressibility. And then this is the year, this is the Kolmogorov complexity versus the year. So you have, in terms of when you program a game in one of these platforms, you get a certain amount of complexity for the game. It could be characterized as lexical diversity, compressibility, or Kolmogorov complexity. And this is dilution kills diversity. And I guess, I don't know exactly, we'll have to go to the paper to find out what they mean by that. But you can see that there's a decrease over time in this complexity. And so they kind of talk about the growth of natural text and computer codes and how that can vary with complexity and some of these other measures. And so they kind of compare it with GPT. Basically, the lesson here is we've been here before, and they're using these old video game systems to get at the problem. And the problem here is the dilution of expertise and the rise and fall of collective innovation. So this is diversity drives both biological and artificial evolution. A prevalent assumption in cultural evolution is that the generation of novel features is an inherent property of a subset of the population, of the experts. So this means that this is something that experts generate novelty, basically. In contrast, diversity, the fraction of objects in the corpus that are unique, exhibits complex collective dynamics such as oscillations that cannot be simply reduced to individual attributes. So this is where we have these unique aspects of the corpus that we can observe. Here we explore how a popular cultural domain can rapidly expand to the point where it exceeds the supply of subject-specific experts, and balance favors imitation over invention. So what they're getting at here, I think, is that there's this argument with respect to large language models that says that if we train large language models on, say, like the internet is generated by human experts. And as such, it has a lot of these, novel features. So there are things that are like factual, but there are also things that human artists make that are novel. The algorithm can be trained on it and then generate things in the style of that novelty. But if you use up all that data and it just becomes like an LLM just kind of training on the data that's there, and then it generates a lot of data to be put on the internet. And then if it's just taking the internet as its input, then it's eventually training on its own generation. And so since it's not a human expert, it's going to pick up a lot of this, what we might call fawn novelty or secondhand novelty that it's already gotten from the original training set. So you're losing a lot of that novelty. And then, basically you have this problem where LLMs sort of become almost tautological. And they're just imitating things from the training set that are not necessarily creative, but they're just kind of like, being recapitulated. I think that's really what they're getting at here, where you exceed the supply of subject-specific experts and you favor imitation over invention. And in early video games, I guess you can see that, where you have and also in human innovation, you have this, where you have an initial sort of set of things that you invent, and then the market maybe favors invention. So you have this novel video game system that you build, or these novel games that you build. And then over time, you expand this domain so that the number of games increases to the size at which you don't really capture. Not every new game is novel. A lot of it is like imitation. And so eventually you get more imitation in the pool than invention. And so that means that your diversity collapses, or your sort of novelty collapses. And so then the entire domain collapses. So that's what they're getting at with large language models. They're trying to characterize what's going on there in the context of these early video game markets and like the things that were generated in that space. So that's what they're saying. At this point, we expect diversity to decrease and information redundancy to increase. So when we have a lot of imitation versus invention, we expect diversity to decrease. So that was that collapse you saw with respect to Kolmogorov complexity, and information redundancy to increase, meaning you have redundant information. Things repeat the same information because it's imitation, as ideas are increasingly copied rather than invented. We test our model predictions on 3 case studies: early personal computers and home consoles, which is the Atari 2600 and the VIC, social media posts, and cryptocurrency. So they look in these different domains. They start out with innovation, and then they observe increasing imitation. And when you get increasing imitation, the diversity collapses, or the Kolmogorov complexity collapses, and that's basically the life cycle of this domain that they're observing. Each example exhibits a relatively abrupt departure from standard diffusion models during the exponential increase in the number of imitators. So you have this increase in the number of imitators who want to imitate the thing that was successful, the innovations that were successful, and so in the process of that, they cheapen the pool, as it were. We attribute this transition to the dilution of expertise, meaning you don't have as many what they call experts, which are just people who are innovating and creating new things. And then instead you have imitators that are creating sort of repetition. Our model recreates observed patterns of diversity, complexity, and artifact trait distributions, as well as the collective boom and bust dynamics of innovation. So that's so we have the gzip plus KNN paper. We have this neural networks is not a silver bullet paper. This is actually the tweet that I talked about there. This is another tweet that kind of goes over that. This is the graph from the paper. So this shows these relationships. This is the approach to the gzip and KNN algorithm. And I think we're done with this. This is the last paper I'll talk about, is the cursor recursion, training ungenerated data makes models forget. And so this is kind of the same argument where if you have these models that train on the internet and they keep training on the internet and then they use up all the data on the internet and they create more data, they can actually end up sort of killing themselves. And so what will happen to GPT-N once large language models contribute much of the language found online? We find that the use of model-generated content in training causes irreversible defects in the resulting models, where tails of the original content distribution disappear. So this is where you get rid of like all the diversity. We refer to this effect as model collapse, and show that it occurs in variational autoencoders, Gaussian mixture models, and large language models. So this model collapse is where you train on the information that's on the internet, reproduce it as an imitator, and then you train on that, and eventually the model collapses because it doesn't have any innovation. It gets rid of all the outliers, and that's that. We built theoretical intuition behind the phenomena and portray its ubiquity amongst all learned generative models. We demonstrate that it has to be taken seriously if we are to sustain the benefits of training from large-scale data scraped from the web. So this is important for maintaining the integrity of large language models. And that's all I have to say about that set of papers. Any questions or comments? Okay. Yeah, so I think that's another thing that is food for thought. I think, like, especially with respect to some of these issues with training and finding the right training set and understanding like what needs to be there in order for something to learn, and maybe like what we actually can learn with. Um, I think I said this last week. I'm kind of experimenting with large language models, running them locally, and I'm using a Silicon Mac, so it's not for lack of computational power. But one of the things you find is that even there, it's hard to run them at the size that they're at. So you have to really kind of. And then what I want to do with them is I want to have like a generalized set of weights, and then I want to have a specific set of weights trained on some of the things that we're doing in some of our projects. So you can have the option of uploading PDFs of papers, and you can train those, sort of a module of the network on just those papers. And of course, you have the general module of weights. So you have like the world, and then you have this little domain, and then you can train the model, and you can actually ask it questions about maybe the research area that you're interested in, and you can find answers that maybe you wouldn't find by reading through the papers. That's what I'm trying to do, and it's very hard to do this locally. You need, the idea is that you need a big, powerful computer. Now, with something like gzip, would be very small, be a very small piece of code, and you might be able to do similar things. Um, so what I think we've talked about the Levin bot before, which is the specialized large language model that sort of apes Michael Levin papers. It basically, you ask it a question, it gives it the answer in the style of Michael Levin because it's trained on all of his papers, and then plus a general model that models the world. And so it's really, that's maybe kind of the direction that I'm talking about. But the question is like, can we make that useful to a research project? B, can we, you know, is it maybe usable at, at the scale we want to do? I mean, I don't know if everyone in the lab, I want to make it accessible for everyone in the lab. So you could like download a model with the papers trained in it and then ask it questions about the research domain. That may be a little bit beyond what we can actually do, but so yeah, that's my thinking in that area, and I think that last section raised a bunch of questions about like model integrity too. Like when you train it on a certain domain, how much can you actually train it? Do you need to really kind of bring in new data constantly, or can you do a lot of your work just by like kind of you know using the same training set, or can you use synthetic data like we talked about on the open source meeting? And is that good enough? Or do you need novelty, continual novelty? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about today is kind of a follow up to the physical computation stuff that we talked about last couple weeks. We've been doing this physical computation arc. And the physical computation arc has been kind of, we've talked about sort of the brain as a computer metaphor and how it's sort of not useful necessarily. But then we talked about, well, physical computation is a different type of computation. A lot of times when people make the brain as computer metaphor, they're talking about like digital computers in the style of von Neumann, right? A von Neumann computer, which is what we use in our everyday lives, and we understand that. But physical computation is based on a different set of principles. It's more like physical on physical things, and we've gone from physics to mathematics to computer science and kind of bridged those gaps. And then we've even talked about biologically inspired physical computation, things like different bacteria and algae that are computing things, or different materials that are computing things. That in itself might be a problematic metaphor, but we have that as a metaphor. We can actually observe the computations. And it's just basically, in that case, it's like people observing different computations that are made by cellular systems, and then they or different organizational shifts in materials, and they're sort of characterizing it as a computation. Now, there aren't a lot of tests for this. It's not like we have like a Turing test for physical. We have the Turing-Deutsch thesis, which we talked about, but I'm not quite sure that that's suitable for some of the examples that we've explored. So this is actually a set of things I put together. So this is a paper by this person, Nima Dagani. And this person works, I think, at MIT, and they're doing a lot of things with the brain and computational models and things like that. So they actually have a paper out. I'm not sure which paper is this one. No, this is a different one. This is the paper, Physical Computation and Compositionality. And so this is, I think it's kind of a computational philosophy paper, but also like just the kind of a theory paper. So this talks about compositionality, which is something we've talked about with respect to AI systems, but is also something that you find in category theory. And so this paper actually talks about physical computation and sort of routes to category theory, where we then can analyze some of these things. And so this has like relevance to biology, it has relevance to the brain. So I'm going to go through the abstract and then go to some of the other stuff in the folder. Developments in quantum computing and more in general non-standard computing systems. So they're interested in these quantum computers, these non-standard computers. We talked about Richard Feynman's views on this a couple weeks back, so that kind of comes out of that. Represents a clear indication that the very notion of what a physical computing device is and does should be recast in a rigorous and sound framework. So again, this is, kind of related to the brain as a computer. We don't have the right language for thinking about the brain as a computer. If we think of the brain as a von Neumann computer, it's probably a tortured metaphor, and it's incomplete. But if we think about the brain as a physical computer of some type, maybe that's more likely or rigorous. Physical computing has opened up a whole stream of new research into understanding and controlling how information is processed by several types of physical devices. And it could be like systems like cellular systems or material systems, or, it could be regulatory networks, circuits like that. Therefore, classical definitions and entire frameworks need to be adapted in order to fit a broader notion of what physical computing systems really are. Recent studies have proposed a formalism that can be used to carve out a more proper notion of physical computing. Now, this is where they get into the compositionality. In this paper, we present a framework which captures such results in a very natural way via some basic constructions in category theory. So category theory is this mathematical tool where it's kind of like throwing out set theory and starting over. You have these categories, they're joined by functors, they have these other types of things like monads and other types of constructions that describe the different aspects of sets and categories and then the relationships between them. So it's a functional theory, and it kind of gets at some of the maybe it's a good tool for this. We'll see. Furthermore, we showed that within our framework, the compositional nature of physical computing systems is naturally formalized. So that's interesting, that there's this compositional nature of these systems that's naturally formalized. So when I say compositional, I mean, if you have something that needs to be put together, like, an algorithm is really about putting things together. It's about searching a data set or a database for a certain set of things. But, if you want to have an intelligent system, those search things will be put together. So you might compose a series of search terms to build like your own database. So you have this database, you have a set of search terms, and then those search terms will then be compiled in a certain way so that you build a data set of your own that will, sort of be more focused on the things you want to know. And that's actually kind of an intelligent system. That's physical computing if you apply it not to like bits, but to the physical world. So you can have this compositional system in the physical world, and it follows computational rules in the sense that it's doing a lot of things that a computer would do. And then it can be organized in coherent structures by means of the relational nature. So this is where they kind of get into, what a physical computer is. And this has a lot of connections to thermodynamics. So we talked about the arrow of thermodynamics, that things go in one direction. So we actually want to go from physical systems to mathematical abstraction, and that's where we're have a lot of questions that are interesting and probably essential to building a physical computer. So one example of some of the things that we need to understand is things like, does a rock compute its trajectory? Okay, well, probably we don't know, probably not. And this goes back to the causality thing. So if we ask that question, it's important for a physical computer, because if you have a rock and you're measuring it, maybe it gets thrown, or maybe it falls off a cliff, but it moves. Does it compute its trajectory? Probably not. But we don't know that for sure. Another form of this question is to reduce the interaction between physical objects to the notion of computation. Do solar systems compute the laws of nature? And so there's some physicists who argue that, say, black holes compute, or things like that. Now that seems a little out there, a lot of these questions. But they're essential questions to ask for like physical systems that are more general. So we don't want to necessarily say a rock computes its trajectory, but there are things in the natural world that may compute their trajectory that we don't think of as sort of having any sort of sentience or anything like that. And in fact, it's not so much a matter of that, it's just a matter of like the system interacting and, being able to extract things from those interactions. When it comes to biological systems, since we don't have any knowledge of their governing laws, the question becomes nuanced and perhaps harder to answer. So, they kind of talk about that. And then they talk about these sort of diagrams where you get these theory experiment relationships, these prediction cycles, these compute cycles. And so you have to model all of this. And so you have to represent this in some way. So this is where they're getting into like category theory, because a lot of these things are categories and they have functional relationships between them. And that's why they're using category theory, or they think it's a suitable tool for kind of making these abstractions that you need. And so this is kind of the argument of the paper. It's pretty dense. It kind of goes into a lot of computer science theory. So this paper talks about, it's kind of going over the paper a little bit. And there's a lot of information in the paper. One of the things that the author points out is naturally is very important to fall into the trap of everything is a computer. So, that's what they call pan-computationalism. And, we don't want to fall into that trap of saying everything is a computer, or that computational principles extend across nature. Oops. Because it is either a trivial notion or a useless definition. Having a solid mathematical formalism immunizes us from pan-computationalism. So if we have a mathematical structure, especially something grounded in a rigorous method, we can make the determination whether something is computational or not. Some things aren't computational. Some things are. We would like to know what those things are. How can one deal with nested dynamical systems? How can one formally describe whether multiple linked processes, such as in a simple living system or a complex organ like the brain, active as a physical computing device? And so the answer can be formalized through category theory, or what he says CAT, which is this specific type of category theory. So, you can deal with like a lot of physical systems or nested dynamical systems, and you have these processes that are linked together. And we talked about causality being one way to look at those, to make sure that they're not like just kind of coincidental. Another way is to have a model like category theory, where you look at the interactions of categories and you have these different nested domains. And so mathematical rigor is really carries the day. This paper brings together physics and computation through the lens of category theory. Category theory is a powerful formalism for dealing with compositionality and state dynamic description. So we can not only describe compositionality or putting pieces together into a larger whole in different orders, but also the state dynamic description, which is where we can describe states and transitions between states. And so if you don't know category theory, don't despair. Check the appendix and have a bag for tears. In other words, it's a very high bar to kind of learn category theory. So we don't want to. So they have actually like this define the category phys-proc of concrete physical systems in a very straightforward way, and they have the definition here, and they have this category phys-proc, which is of course the thing that they're using as sort of the basis for these category theory representations. So this is kind of the way they do this. This is an example of the nested sets that they're doing, these nested computational models. This is an adjoint pair showing different pathways. They're abstracting a physical system and they're representing it computationally. So this would be like a finite state machine and a digital computer, but they're showing it in a different way. They're using these different categories like phys-proc and abs-proc, which are sort of, it constrains the physical computational equivalence. So, your system has to fit into one of these categories to kind of be considered a computer. And then this kind of talks about categorical definitions. I think we've seen that already. And then this is the paper, Physical Computation of Compositionality. The final example, another paper from this author, and they kind of, I just wanted to bring this up really quickly. This is an interesting example of problems from a cell's perspective. So this actually has to do with cellular systems and sort of understanding individual components. So this is examining individual components of a cellular system has been successful at uncovering molecular reactions and interactions. However, attempts to combine these discrete components into a system scale map have failed due to missing links or unknown variables. So we talked about unknown variables in our causal models. Condemned nonlinearities in high-dimensional parameter space, downplayed natural noisiness and stochasticity, ignored causal influence, and disregarded the temporal dynamics. So a lot of people who have taken cellular systems and tried to characterize things like molecular reactions and interactions have really kind of, they had to abstract that system into a computational framework. And because your computational frameworks tend to be discrete and, they have different properties of digital computation, they actually miss a lot of the complexity, a lot of things that, like noisiness and stochasticity and temporal dynamics that are key to these kind of systems. So your abstraction is not great for really understanding the system. You can maybe understand an output in general terms, but you can't capture the dynamics. You can't capture stochastic influences and things like that. So out of equilibrium behaviors are hard to capture. So composite static and phenomenological descriptions, while they may look complicated, lack the essence of what makes biological systems truly complex. So again, these descriptions are maybe compact, but they don't capture complexity. Formalization of systems level problems is the key to constructing a meta theory of biology. So this is actually where we think about a meta theory of biology. This work aims to identify a few problems that cells must solve as a template for such formalization as a step towards axiomatizing biological investigations. So this is growing from this sort of category theory approach. This kind of focuses on axiomatic biology, which is a key to sort of this category theoretic approach. And the the title of this paper is Considering Hilbert's Approach, Problems from a Cell's Perspective. So David Hilbert was a mathematician in the 19th century, and he argued that the whole world could be characterized using axioms. And this turned out not to necessarily be the case, but axioms are actually quite important in terms of designing algorithms. Like, algorithms really do operate basically on axioms. And so if we're talking about algorithms, a lot of times we're talking about axioms. And so, this is kind of it's almost like Hilbert's revenge in a lot of ways. That you have this, you have these axiomatizing approaches, not only to the world in general, but biology specifically. So Woodger, which I remember reading his book on classifying the tree of life using axioms. And there's some other schemes to approaching biology using axioms. Those are failed attempts at axiomatizing biology. Those failures were due to shortcomings in proper formalization of the key problems in biology. So you can take like a biological system, like a tree of life, and you can build it using axioms, but you're not capturing the actual thing that makes the tree of life interesting, which is that it maps to life. It just kind of looks like a binary tree or something like that. So these axiomatic systems can be applied to systems like biology. They're failed examples because they don't capture what makes these systems what they are. So he goes through a lot of the stuff with, actually he talks about the paper, Can a Biologist Fix a Radio? In that, can we truly understand the inner workings of a cell? And the argument here is that you may be able to do it, but you have to have the right system to capture these things. So this is kind of talking about some of these axiomatic approaches and how previous approaches failed, but this approach might actually work. So that's it. That's all I have to say on that topic. That's following up our physical computation discussion. So I think that's the last discussion we'll have in physical computation. The last time we talked about turning that into something interesting in terms of scholarship. So I don't know what that looks like. It could be papers, it could be presentations, it could be different projects where we explore some of these things. But I'd like to move on, continue on in this area. Okay, so I think that's it for today, unless anyone has anything else they want to talk about. Yeah, no problem. Interesting concept. A lot of things that we talked about today, I apologize for the kind of speed that we went through them, but I think they're connected, and yeah, we'll see where this leads. All right. Yeah, no problem. Thank you it was quite interesting. So, okay, thank you. I'll see you next week. Have a good week. Yeah, looking forward to it. Bye.